The snow hadn't let up in 3 days. Not that Laura Wren noticed. She was too focused on the train window, too focused on her girl's shivering shoulders pressed into her sides, too focused on the crumpled letter in her lap, creased and stained with time, as fragile as hope itself. She had worn her best coat for this journey, olive wool, worn thin at the elbows. Her gloves had been patched twice, and her bonnet, well, it had seen better years. But she sat up straight, her spine unyielding, and told her daughters with a smile that the West would be a place of beginnings. "Do you think he'll be waiting?" asked the smaller twin, Lottie, the one who still believed in happy endings. Laura glanced down. "If he's a good man, he will." The other twin, May, didn't ask. She just stared at the snowy blur outside, eyes too quiet for a child of 7. That silence worried Laura more than anything. The letter said, "You'll have a home here. My land is good, my heart honest." It had come 6 months ago, and in those 6 months, 100 small things had gone wrong. Her brother's refusal to house her, the landlord's final warning, the church pantry's dwindling patience. She'd sold her ring for train fare, said goodbye to the only town that ever knew her name, and whispered to her girls that the West was kinder. The train hissed and wheezed as it slowed. Her girls clutched her skirts. The town came into view, not grand or bustling, but not desolate either. Wood buildings wore snow like shawls, and chimney smoke curled upward in sleepy spirals. She hoped it meant warmth. She hoped it meant someone had shoveled a path for them. She stepped off the train with her daughters in tow and looked for a man with a red scarf, the sign he'd promised. No one stood with such a scarf. A few men lingered near the platform, unloading crates, avoiding eye contact. A woman walked by briskly, clutching a baby wrapped in blue flannel. The station master nodded politely, but offered no greeting. Laura stood her ground for an hour. Her feet numbed, her hands stiffened. Lottie began to cry. May said nothing, only leaned into her mother and stared at the wooden sign, "Welcome to Carver's Hollow." Inside the station house, the heat barely touched the edges of the room. The man behind the desk barely looked up when she asked after Mr. Roland Bell, the man she'd come to meet. He scratched his beard, flipped through a dusty ledger, and finally muttered, "Bell? Oh, he married someone else back in September. Local girl. Didn't mention expectant company." Laura stared at him. "He said he sent no letters," the man added. "You sure you weren't fooled by some scribbler?" She couldn't speak, couldn't cry, couldn't fall apart with her daughters watching. She thanked the man, because it was habit, and stepped back out into the snow. The town had turned colder in the hour she'd waited. She pulled the girls toward the inn, a square wooden structure leaning just slightly to the left. Inside, warmth rushed up from the floor, and her legs gave a little from relief. The woman at the desk gave her a long once-over. "One night. That's all I can give. We're full up with traders and ranch hands. 3 beds, no firewood. You'll need to bring your own." Laura offered what coin she had, 6 bits and a Canadian penny. The woman eyed it, then handed over a small iron key. "Room 4. Best eat now, before the stew's gone." The dining room was full of noise, boots stomping, spoons clanking, and the low hum of men speaking in curt tones. Laura and the girls huddled at a corner table. They shared one bowl of stew. The meat was stringy, the bread dry, but it was hot. Lottie whispered, "Where's our home?" Laura smoothed her hair. "It's out there. We just need time to find it." The girls slept close together that night, curled into one another like pups, while Laura sat in the corner chair, coat still on, staring at the window fogged with frost. Her thoughts spiraled. She had no land, no man, no prospects. Just 2 daughters, and a name no one in town recognized. The next morning, the innkeeper met her in the hall. "Checkout's in an hour. Rooms already spoken for." Laura nodded. "Thank you for the night." It wasn't the woman's fault. Mercy had limits. She wrapped the girls in every layer they had and stepped out into the pale morning light. Her boots crunched through the snow, down the main street where shopkeepers swept porches with tired arms. No one looked up, or if they did, their eyes flicked past her like she was wind-blown paper caught in the eaves. She asked at the general store for work. The man said they didn't need help. She asked at the church. The preacher was kind, but vague. Times are tight. God watches, though. That afternoon, she sat behind the livery with her girls, sharing a heel of bread. They had found a dry crate to sit on, and the wind had less bite in that alley. Lottie asked, "Mama, are we poor?" Laura hesitated. "We're just between blessings." May said, "Does that mean no dinner?" Laura didn't answer. She couldn't. A boot scraped against the gravel. She looked up. A man stood a few yards away, hat low, scarf dusted with snow. He didn't speak, just set down a canvas, sack near her feet, and turned to go. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She stood slowly. "Thank you." He nodded, then kept walking. She opened the sack, 2 loaves, half a salted ham, a block of cheese. The girls gasped. "Is he an angel?" Laura smiled, "The first in hours. He might just be." She didn't know then that his name was Samuel Hart. A widower, quiet like the snow itself. That night, they slept in an abandoned storage shed near the church. The roof had holes, but the wind stayed low. She wrapped the girls in blankets, then lay down beside them, listening to their small breaths. Her thoughts churned. She had no choice but to stay. There was no train fare back. And even if there were, back meant hunger, pity, and no peace. Here, at least, no one knew her shame. The next morning, she knocked on the back door of the bakery and offered to scrub pots. The baker's wife let her in. No pay, but scraps. She cleaned until her arms ached, then left with a paper bundle of bread ends and burned crusts. Day by day she worked, quietly, unpaid. Bread here, stew there. She swept the church steps, mended a seam for the pastor's wife. She taught her girls to wait silently while she sewed by candlelight. A woman from the boarding house asked for help washing linens. 1 coin. Laura pressed it in her palm like it was gold. One evening, as she walked back to the shed with frozen toes and red knuckles, she saw him again. Samuel Hart, standing outside the general store. He looked at her, then nodded once. She nodded back. She didn't know his story yet, that his wife had died 3 winters ago, buried beneath a cottonwood tree on his land, that he'd closed off the extra room in his cabin and stopped speaking to neighbors, that he'd come into town once a month, bought what he needed, and left without words. He didn't offer help, just acknowledgement. It was more than the town had given. One night, Lottie coughed through her sleep. Laura sat up, her heart racing. The child's cheeks were too red, her fingers cold. She wrapped her close and prayed for morning. When light broke, Laura ran to the doctor's office. He was busy, said to come back after supper. She returned at dusk, coin in hand. "She's just cold. Keep her warm, and she'll be fine." Laura left with the coin still clutched. She bought firewood instead. That night, there was a knock on the shed door. Samuel Hart stood there, holding a bundle of kindling and a small cast-iron stove. "Had this in storage," he said. Laura didn't know what to say. He placed it down gently, then left. Later, when her daughters slept warm for the first time in weeks, she sat by that stove, holding the same letter that had brought her west. It crackled as she fed it to the flame. The past was gone. The dream was over. But her girls were warm. She was still standing. And that was something. Laura didn't count days anymore. Not since the shed had become their home and routine their refuge. Each morning began the same. She stoked the little stove Samuel had brought, boiled a tin of snow for tea, and gently woke the girls with a whisper and a kiss to their cheeks. She never mentioned the hunger. Some days brought blessings. Others, closed doors and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. But still she worked, scrubbing, stitching, baking pies from scrap ingredients traded in whispers and goodwill. She folded herself into the cracks of the town, quiet and persistent, like ivy finding its way through stone. The whispers didn't stop. Behind her back, she was the one who came for a man and got left in the snow. Women called her unlucky. Some crossed the street when she passed. A few pitied her, but pity was a weight she refused to carry. Her strength lay in her silence, in the way she listened instead of defended, endured instead of begged. She was not broken, just tired. The girls began to help. May collected kindling, careful with her fingers. Lottie, small but spry, ran errands for the baker in exchange for flour dust and sweet crusts. Laura sewed in the evenings by lantern light, taking in hems and darning socks for those who would trade food or coins. One afternoon, while trading a mended apron for 2 eggs, Laura caught sight of herself in the shop's dusty mirror. Her cheeks were pale, eyes sunken. But there was a steadiness there too, a quiet fire she hadn't seen before. She barely recognized herself, and she wasn't sure if that frightened or steadied her. Samuel Hart appeared again in small ways. A silent man with a careful gait, he would nod if their paths crossed. One morning, she found a split pile of wood outside the shed. Another evening, a jar of lard left on the steps. He never stayed, never asked for thanks. The girls grew used to his presence. "That man with the kind face," Lottie said one morning. "I think he's watching over us." Laura didn't answer. But later that night, she placed a loaf of fresh cornbread wrapped in cloth on his cabin steps and walked away before the door creaked open. The town's rhythm continued around her. Sunday sermons, shop bells, wagon wheels crunching frozen dirt. Laura stayed just outside of it all, never quite invited, never quite invisible. She was tolerated, sometimes nodded to, occasionally offered scraps of gossip or offhand advice, but never warmth. Not from the town that belonged to her girls, and quietly, to the man who asked for nothing and gave pieces of himself like he didn't want anyone to notice. Winter deepened. The snow thickened, the air brittle with cold. She bartered a pie for woolen scarves from the preacher's wife, whose hands shook from age. In return, Laura offered to read her scriptures aloud, voice steady, soft in the parlor where fire flickered low. "You've got patience in your soul," the woman said after the reading. "That's rarer than gold out here." Laura smiled but said nothing. Patience didn't fill bellies. A week later, May fell ill. It started with a cough, then a fever. Laura wrapped her in every blanket they had, tucked her against the stove, spooned broth made from bones and melted snow. Lottie tried to help, wiping her sister's brow, singing in a whisper. Laura stayed awake 3 nights straight. She begged at the doctor's again, offered everything, sewn goods, firewood, pies. "She needs rest." "Nothing else I can do," he said, then added, "You ought to think about sending her to someone better off." Laura didn't scream. She just turned and walked away. She couldn't give her child away. Not again. Not ever. That night, she wept for the first time in months. Head in her arms, the girls asleep, the wind outside louder than her sobs. The next morning, the shed door opened quietly. Samuel stood there, eyes moving past Laura to the bundle curled by the fire. Without a word, he stepped in and lifted May into his arms. Laura moved to stop him, but he shook his head. "She needs real warmth." "I've got it." Laura followed him through the snow, heart pounding. His cabin stood a mile out, nestled at the edge of the forest. Smoke rose from the chimney. The door opened into heat and space and the scent of pine and stew. He laid May in a real bed, tucked blankets around her, and stepped aside. Laura sank to her knees beside her daughter and held her hand until the girl's breathing steadied. Samuel said nothing, just stirred the fire and handed Lottie a cup of warm milk. That night, Laura didn't leave. She slept on the floor beside the bed, hand clasped around her child's fingers, the flames crackling steady behind her. In the morning, May's fever had broken. "You can stay," Samuel said. Laura shook her head. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said. "It's shelter. You've earned it 10 times over." She didn't argue, not with her daughter breathing easier. The days after were a quiet adjustment. Samuel left early, worked the land, chopped wood, shoveled snow. Laura cleaned, cooked, and mended. She taught the girls to help. May now upright, slower, but laughing again. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was not awkward. It was respectful, like 2 people rebuilding from the same wreckage. One evening, Samuel came in from a cold, shaking snow from his coat. Laura was kneading bread. The girls were playing by the fire. He watched for a long moment, then said, "You've made this place feel alive again." Laura looked up, flour on her hands, and for the first time, didn't feel the need to apologize for existing. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in white. Inside, warmth held its ground. Later that week, Laura returned to town alone. She walked through the market square, now familiar. The butcher offered her bones for broth. The baker saved her the best end crusts. The preacher's wife called her by name. The whispers had changed. They no longer clung to her like frostbite. Now they drifted like smoke, faint, harmless, fading. She wasn't just the woman who came west and got left behind. She was the woman who stayed. And that made all the difference. When she returned to the cabin, the girls ran to her, scarves askew, cheeks pink. Samuel stood on the porch, axe in hand, watching the road. "You're late," he said. "I stopped to trade pies," she replied, brushing snow from her shawl. He smiled just a flicker. "I figured." That night, they ate stew around a table warmed by hands and quiet laughter. Laura looked at her girls, their bright eyes, their steady joy. Then she looked at Samuel, who never reached for her but always stood near. She thought, maybe this wasn't survival anymore. Maybe it was the start of something more. Laura didn't call it love. Not at first. She called it stillness, the kind that wrapped itself around her shoulders at dusk after the girls were asleep and the fire had burned down to a soft glow. A kind of peace she hadn't known since before her husband died, before the long unraveling that had brought her here. It lived in the quiet moments, in the way Samuel handed her a chipped mug of coffee without asking if she needed one, in the way he let her speak or stay silent, both without expectation. There was no rush between them, no fluttering glances or awkward silences. Just time shared, measured not in declarations, but in small gestures, an extra blanket folded at the end of her bedroll, the way he salted stew exactly how she liked it, the way he left her favorite book by the windowsill on the mornings he rode out early. She hadn't told him her whole story, and he hadn't asked. She knew only pieces of his lost wife, child buried young, a man whose grief had turned into routine until it dulled him. But one evening, as the snow piled high against the cabin walls and the girls drew in the foggy window panes with their fingertips, Laura sat across from him at the table and asked softly, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Samuel didn't look up. He turned the page of his book, exhaled, and said, "Every day, until I hear your daughter's laugh." She didn't answer, didn't need to. That night, she found a scarf folded on her pillow, hand-stitched, blue thread, his initials in the corner, neat, quiet stitches. The next morning, she mended his torn flannel shirt, not because it needed it, but because she needed to do something for him, something small, something kind. The winter dragged on, relentless and beautiful. Each day began with chores and ended with laughter. The girls took to calling him Mr. Hart less and Sam more. Once, Lottie slipped and called him Papa. Silence followed. Samuel looked at Eliza, uncertain. Laura only smiled and kept peeling potatoes. The land outside remained frozen, but the space between them began to thaw. Sometimes, when the girls played by the fire, Samuel would sit beside Laura and ask about her favorite books. She'd mention old stories, tales she read long ago and thought forgotten. A week later, the exact book would appear on the mantel, left with care and no comment. She started writing again. Short things, letters never sent, verses in the margins of old journals, memories preserved not for pain, but for proof. One morning, Samuel found her scribbling and asked to read them. She hesitated. "They're not poems," she warned. "Just thoughts." He read them anyway. Then he folded the page, handed it back, and said, "You make grief sound like weather, something we live through." It was the first time she saw tears in his eyes. Just a glint, but enough. The cabin, once cold and functional, bloomed into something more. A red quilt appeared on the girls' bed. Candles lined the windowsills. Pine cones collected in bowls. A pair of snow boots gifted from the preacher's wife sat by the door, Eliza size, no questions asked. They began to feel like a family, though no one said the word aloud. One afternoon, Laura returned from the church with a basket of donated goods. Samuel stood outside, splitting logs. His sleeves rolled to his elbows. She paused on the porch, watching him. His movements were steady, rhythmic, like breathing. When he looked up and caught her gaze, neither of them looked away. She stepped forward and handed him a biscuit from the basket. Their hands touched briefly. She pulled back, but the moment lingered. That night, they sat close. The fire was low, the room dim. He read aloud while she stitched, his voice calm and even. "You read like you've lived it," she said. "Sometimes I have," he replied. The girls drifted to sleep early. Laura stayed beside the fire, the needle pausing in her hand. He cleared his throat. "I never thought I'd fill this house again." She said nothing, just looked around at the blankets on the chairs, the children's drawings on the wall, the sound of soft breathing behind the bedroom curtain. Then she looked at him and whispered, "Neither did I." In that silence, something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a deep understanding that whatever had brought them here, pain, survival, grace, it had not been wasted. The days grew longer. The snow began to melt in patches. Ice dripped from a roof, like a ticking clock. Laura found herself humming again, quietly as she swept, soft as she cooked. Her hands had loosened. Her shoulders had relaxed. Samuel noticed. "You sing when you don't realize it," he said one morning. "I used to before," she replied. "You should again." She smiled. She had learned to survive without needing anyone. But now she was learning to rest. One afternoon, he returned from town with a book wrapped in brown paper. No title on the front. She opened it at the table and blinked back a tear. Inside was a blank journal, the pages thick and inviting. "I thought maybe your words should live somewhere better than the margins," he said. She reached for his hand then. Not bold, not dramatic. Just quiet fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. That evening, after the girls were asleep, she read him one of her entries aloud. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "You write the way people pray." She didn't cry. Not then. But later, when he handed her a folded note, just a line of his own scribbled in careful ink. She did. "I never knew silence could feel like safety. Until you." She tucked it into the journal. They didn't speak of love. Not yet. But love had begun to bloom in the room's quietest corners. In the way he saved the last bite of stew for her. In the way she brushed snow off his shoulders when he came inside. In the glances. The shared laughter. The knowledge that neither of them owed the other anything. And still they stayed. One night, as a late frost blew outside and the girls giggled under blankets, Samuel sat at the hearth, Laura beside him, both wrapped in the same quilt. He turned to her and said softly, "I was wrong before." "About what?" "I said you reminded me of someone. But you don't. You're not like anyone I've ever known." She looked at him, fully now. No fear. No shame. "You don't have to say anything," he added quickly. But she did. "I'm not like I used to be. I don't even know who I am anymore." "I do," he said. She took his hand. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind settled. Inside, everything changed. The last snow came quietly in the night. By morning, it blanketed the earth one final time, as if winter itself was saying goodbye. The cabin windows glowed gold from a hearth, and smoke curled skyward into a pale blue sky that promised warmth eventually. Laura stood on the porch, shawl wrapped tight, watching the road that led into town. She could hear the girls laughing inside as they braided ribbons into one another's hair. Their voices were no longer fragile. They sang now, even when they didn't know she was listening. Samuel stepped out beside her. He carried his coat over one arm, a clean shirt freshly pressed beneath it. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little." "They'll look. They always do. I'm not afraid of being looked at anymore." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to town on foot. Snow softened their steps, but the sky held no threat. Along the way, neighbors passed in buggies, tip-tats, and nodded. Some even smiled. No one turned away anymore. The story had shifted. And Laura knew it wasn't just hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever been cast aside and stood up again without anyone's permission. The chapel was warm with bodies and light. Music played low from a fiddle. Today was the spring gathering, a celebration of winter's end, of crops soon to be sown, of births and baptisms, and a reason to wear one's finest clothes. Laura wore blue, the same shade as the scarf Samuel had stitched that first winter. May and Lottie skipped ahead, their braids gleaming, dresses hemmed and washed with care. When they stepped into the chapel hall, conversations quieted, heads turned. For a moment, Laura felt the weight of every whisper from the past year pressing against her spine. And then Samuel reached for her hand, not discreetly, not in the shadows, but there in front of everyone. She looked up at him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The preacher smiled from the pulpit. The townsfolk shifted, made room. A woman who once avoided her gaze nodded and gestured for them to join her row. And Laura walked forward, not small, not sorry. Her daughters followed behind like grace made visible. The music swelled. Voices lifted in him. As the congregation stood, Samuel leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Will you dance with me later? If I remember how. I'll lead." After the service, tables of food were laid out in the yard behind the chapel. Children played tag among the fence posts. Elderly men smoked pipes near the stove barrels. Women clustered together with coffee cups and warm gossip. Laura moved through it all with calm ease. She greeted the baker, thanked the preacher's wife, helped a young mother who dropped her shawl. No one recoiled. No one turned. By the time the fiddler started tuning again, Samuel was waiting near the center of the gathering, hand outstretched. Laura didn't hesitate. They danced slowly at first. He held her with care, not claiming her, but honoring her. Around them, others began to join, couples, old friends, even children. Someone clapped. Then another. The music picked up. Laura laughed aloud, a clear sound that startled even her. Samuel smiled. "You're different," he said. She nodded. "I think I finally believe I'm allowed to be." As the music ended, the townsfolk applauded. Samuel didn't let go of her hand. Then, without pomp or pretense, he knelt before her. Gasps echoed. The twins froze wide-eyed. Eliza's breath caught. He pulled no ring from his coat, only looked up at her with quiet conviction. "This isn't for show. You already saved my life. I'm just asking for permission to spend the rest of it proving I'm worthy of that." Laura didn't answer with words. She bent down, took his face in her hands, and kissed him, not for the town, not for the twins, but for herself. The wind blew gently, stirring the melting snow at their feet. The moment held. Then Lottie hooped, and May giggled, and the crowd erupted with warm laughter and clapping. Samuel rose. Laura stood beside him, no longer in his shadow, but beside him, where she belonged. Later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and stars appeared like silver nails in a violet sky, Laura stood at the cabin porch again. She watched the snow recede in patches on the distant fields. The girls slept inside, their hands still sticky with pie, and their faces sunburnt with joy. Samuel joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist. She leaned into him and whispered, "Do you think they'll forget what I was?" He shook his head. "No, but I think they'll remember what you became more." They stood in silence for a long time. Then, softly, she said, "I used to be afraid of being seen. And now I see myself." He kissed the top of her head. She smiled, and the wind whispered its approval. So if the world ever tries to make you smaller, if it laughs when you arrive on the wrong train, if it slams doors and turns backs and calls you too late, too poor, too shamed, remember Laura Wren. She crossed winter alone, with 2 children and no promises, and still found a way to be someone's miracle. And if you are someone who's been cast aside, who eats in corners and walks roads no one shovels, know this: even snow melts. Even hearts, when tended with patience, thaw. You don't need to be rescued. You just need to be seen. And you will be, one day, when the world's ready for the kind of strength that never had to raise its voice to be heard. The desert breathed dust like an old man wheezing out his final thoughts. All around, the land was painted in the fading gold of late evening, as if God himself had taken one last brushstroke across the sky and set down the sun. Wind curled around dry mesquite and leaned into the battered bones of a once proud ranch, Boone Hollow, though no one but the man who lived there still called it that. Elias Boone had the look of a man who'd outlived too many things: storms, cattle rustlers, the slow dying of dreams. His shoulders bore the weight of drought and sorrow, and the way he moved, deliberate, silent, like a man always listening for something that never comes, told you more about him than a biography ever could. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words in the last 2 days, but his hands worked ceaselessly. The fence along the southern pasture was giving out again. One post at a time, he reset it beneath the watchful glare of a sky that hadn't wept in 3 months. Every movement was dust, sweat, and silence. The house sat squat on a rise above the valley, its roof bowed like an old soldier's spine. Inside, nothing stirred but the slow creak of the floorboards, the ticking of a cracked-faced clock, and the rustle of wind fingering lace curtains his late wife once stitched. She was not dead, not in the way graves made people gone. She had left years ago, with a saddlebag and her silence, and that was perhaps the crueler death. Elias did not mourn her anymore. He mourned the ghost of himself that had loved her. By dusk, the heat had slackened enough to let the night come in with its cool sigh. He stood on his porch, one boot braced against the railing, sipping from a chipped enamel cup that held more memory than coffee. That's when he noticed the footprints, small, uneven things weaving through the dust like something wounded. He followed them with his eyes, and then, with something closer to instinct, began to follow with his feet. Half a mile out, near the dry creek, he saw them. A woman crumpled beneath a low mesquite tree, her dress torn at the hem, the fabric clinging to a body half-starved and sunburnt. She had collapsed in the sand like something laid down to die. Around her, 3 small forms huddled, children, their bones visible under tight skin, their arms wrapped around one another like roots trying to find soil. For a moment, Elias just stood there. The wind sighed. The woman raised her head. Their eyes met. Hers were a faded green, sharp despite the weakness in her limbs. She looked at him not like someone begging for rescue, but like someone daring the world to leave her again. "We won't stay long," she said. Her voice cracked like old leather. It wasn't the words that moved him, but the way she held herself even now, like a woman who'd been told too often that she was nothing and had decided instead to be steel. He didn't answer, just crouched low and reached for one of the children, a boy no older than 5. The child flinched at first, then let himself be lifted, too weak to fight, too tired to fear. They didn't ask his name. He didn't ask theirs. He simply turned and walked back toward the house, the child pressed against his chest, breathing shallow. By the time the stars began to spill across the sky, the house was no longer empty. The children were curled up on the floor before the hearth, too light to disturb the old wood. The woman, Lucille May, she'd said, though only once, sat on a stool near the door, not quite inside the house, not quite out. She watched him as he poured a ladle of water into a tin cup and passed it to her. Her hands trembled as she took it, but she didn't spill a drop. The children didn't cry. That was what struck him most. Not once had they whimpered or reached out. Whatever they'd lived through had taught them silence. "I can go come morning," she said. "I just needed one night. Somewhere they could sleep without snakes or men." Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. He walked to the kitchen, pulled an extra blanket from the cabinet, and handed it to her. She didn't thank him, but she unfolded it slowly and wrapped it around her shoulders. Not like a gift, like a loan she intended to repay. He slept that night in the barn, the air sweet with hay and smoke. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he didn't want her to think she owed him anything more than space. Maybe he just needed the distance to remember how loneliness had once been his only company, and now it had shape and breath and green eyes that didn't flinch. By morning, she was still there. So were the children. She had swept the floor, washed the children's faces in water warmed on the stove. One boy, dark-haired, with a stubborn mouth, was stacking kindling by the door. The girl, wide-eyed and quieter than the others, was wrapping a worn ribbon around her wrist like it was the only thing left that was hers. Lucille May didn't meet his eyes as he came in. "Thought you'd have run," he said. She stirred the pot on the stove, though it held only boiled oats. Didn't have the strength or the heart to wake them. They ain't used to kindness. You think this is kindness? She glanced up. You didn't ask what I'd done, or what they are to me. I don't need to, he said, then walked back out to the porch. In truth, he didn't need to know. It was written in the way she moved, in the cautious tilt of her voice, the way she watched everything like it might turn on her. And the children, no blood needed to say they were hers. They watched her like she was the only lighthouse left in a sea of burning ships. He repaired the south gate that morning, while the children sat in the dust, making shapes with sticks. The girl, Lainey, he'd caught the name when one of the boys shouted, brought him a daisy she'd found behind the shed. He took it without a word and tucked it behind his ear. The smile she gave him then, quick, unsure, vanishing like mist, stayed with him longer than it should have. Over the next few days, Lucille didn't ask to stay, and Elias didn't ask when she'd leave. She swept, cooked, nursed the children's coughs with old prairie herbs. She moved around the house like someone trying not to be seen, but slowly forgetting how to stay invisible. One afternoon, while fixing a broken shutter, Elias saw her standing barefoot in the yard, head tilted to the sun. The children were chasing a butterfly, their laughter jagged and bright. She looked like a woman remembering what it felt like to hope. Later that night, as he sat on the porch sipping his coffee, she came and stood beside him. Not close, not far. They were born in a storm, she said, eyes on the stars. 3 of them all at once. He left the next day. He didn't ask who. He said I was a burden. Said they'd ruin his chances. I begged him not to go. He went anyway. Still, Elias said nothing. I ain't asking for your sympathy, she added. Just don't mistake me for soft. I don't, he said quietly. They stood there a while, the hush between them not empty, but full of everything unspoken. By the 5th evening, Lucille cooked cornbread and hung laundry on the line. Elias brought back a bag of oats from town and didn't comment when she refilled the pantry. That night, the children slept in the small bedroom that had belonged to Elias's daughter, the one that never lived past the womb. He had kept it closed for years. Now, the scent of soap and sleep drifted out from it like something forgiven. As Elias stood in the doorway, watching them breathe, Lucille came up beside him. I'll be gone soon, she said. You've done more than enough. You fixed the roof, he said. And the coffee's been hot since you came. She smiled, tired and knowing. I'm not a woman easy to keep. I'm not a man who tries. The silence that followed was the kind that only comes when 2 people know they won't say what they really feel. Not yet. But as he turned in for the night, Elias Boone found that for the first time in a long while, he didn't dread the morning. Morning came slow to Boone Hollow, brushing its fingers across the landscape like a woman smoothing the wrinkles from an old quilt. The light filtered through the lace curtains, catching motes of dust in the air, making them shimmer like forgotten stars. The children stirred first, their bare feet padding across the wood floor, soft as whispers. Lucille moved next. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and went outside to pump water before the sun climbed too high. She didn't ask where the buckets were. She had already found them. Elias watched from the porch. He hadn't meant to, but he rose earlier these days. Maybe because something about the house had changed, not louder, not fuller exactly, but warmer in places where cold used to nest. She carried the bucket on her hip like a child. The motion was practiced, the muscle memory of someone who had learned long ago not to rely on comfort. Inside, the girl, Lainey, helped stir the oats. Her tongue caught between her teeth as she mimicked Lucille's motions. The boys stacked wood beside the stove. One hummed a tune that didn't belong to any known melody. The other coughed twice, then went quiet. No complaints. No asking. Elias had seen a lot of children in his time, some spoiled, some hard-eyed before they reached 10, but never ones this silent. They watched him like strays unsure of a hand's intention. He didn't try to win them, didn't kneel or joke or soften his voice. He just made room, at the table, by the hearth, under the porch shade. And in time, they began to fill it. On the 3rd day, Lucille patched one of his old shirts. She didn't ask permission, just sat in the corner sewing. the thread flashing through the cloth like lightning across clouded sky. "You don't need to do that," he said, not unkindly. "I know," she replied, not looking up. And that was the end of it. She moved through the house like someone fixing a place that didn't belong to her, but it started to feel like it could. Not yet home, but a shelter. A rhythm formed, not spoken, but understood. She cooked. He worked the fences. The children explored the property in widening loops, coming back with pockets full of stones and stories they never told. One afternoon, the oldest boy, Levi Elias now knew, followed him out to the barn. Didn't say a word, just mimicked his steps, his gestures, even the way he leaned on the post. After a long while, Elias handed him a hammer and pointed to a loose plank. The boy's grip was awkward, but determined. When they finished, Elias nodded. "Good." The boy's chest lifted like it might float away, but he said nothing. Just walked back to the house and told his sister, who clapped her hands once before quieting again. Lucille noticed. "You didn't have to let him help," she said that night as they sat near the fire. The children were asleep, sprawled in a tangle of limbs and blankets. "I didn't," Elias agreed. She smiled, small and tired. "He wants to matter. Don't we all?" She looked over at him then, and something softened in her gaze. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. Like the edge of thaw, when winter hasn't fully let go. He offered her a tin mug of warm cider. She took it, holding it like something precious. "My folks were coal dust and mule sweat," she said after a while. "Never taught me much beyond how to survive. When the babies came, I didn't know how to be soft with them." Elias didn't answer. He just looked at the children, peaceful now in sleep, and shook his head slightly. "You didn't fail," he said. "You endured." Lucille closed her eyes at that. Whether from pain or gratitude, he couldn't tell. The next morning, Lainey brought him a dead butterfly in her hand. "For you," she said, eyes wide. "It's still beautiful." He took it and placed it on the mantel, careful not to crush its wings. That evening, Lucille told him the full truth. Not because he asked, but because the silence between them had grown deep enough to hold it. They had come from a mining town, Gravel Ridge, a place Elias had heard of only in curses. Her husband, Jonas Whitlow, had been a hard man with small ambitions. When the mind slowed, his kindness dried up with it. "He said I was the wrong kind of woman," she said. "Too proud, too mouthy, too much." Elias watched the fire flicker in her eyes. "When I got pregnant, he said I did it on purpose. Said I wanted to trap him. He leave before they were born." She nodded. "Left a note that said he wasn't built for chains. And the law. They came looking. Said I was unfit, that I'd abandoned the house. I hadn't. I was sleeping in the woods behind it. They took one look at the babies and said it wasn't enough." Elias felt something old and hot stir in his chest. Anger wasn't useful out here, not like tools or fences, but it was there just the same. "They're mine," she said. "Always will be." He didn't speak, just stood and walked out to the barn, where he spent an hour hammering nails that didn't need hammering. The next day, he took the wagon into town and returned with flour, beans, and peppermint candies. He handed the bag to Lucille without a word. She didn't thank him, but her hand brushed his as she took it, and the look she gave him stayed in his bones all night. Days passed like wind through grass. The quiet between them became comfortable. She began humming while she cooked. He began leaving his coffee where she could reach it. The children grew rounder in the cheeks. Lainey started singing to the goats. Levi carved a slingshot and never used it. The youngest, Eli, sat beside Elias during chores, handing him nails like a squire. One twilight, Elias played his fiddle for the first time in years. The notes were rough at first, then settled into a slow waltz. Lucille stood in the doorway, holding the littlest boy against her hip. She didn't smile, but her foot tapped softly on the floor, just once, just enough to mark the beat. Later, they sat on the porch. The stars were bleeding into the sky, like ink into water. "I don't understand you," she said softly. He looked over. "You don't talk much. You don't ask much. You just make space. Talking's never fixed much for me." "Still," she said, "it's kind." It's necessary. She shook her head. You don't owe me this. Don't mean I can't offer it. She didn't reply, but she stayed on the porch after he went inside, long enough that the night insects began to sing. Elias watched her from the window, not like a man watching a woman, but like a man trying to understand a kind of weather he'd never seen before. She wasn't beautiful in the way stories said women should be. She was thinner than health allowed, scarred in places no eyes should see, and proud enough to mistake for harshness. But something about her made the house feel more alive than it had in years. She was, without trying, becoming real to him. The next morning, the mule refused to eat. Elias crouched beside the animal, muttering low. Lucille appeared at his side with a mix of cornmeal and honey, a trick she said her grandmother once used. The mule took it grudgingly. You know your way around stubborn creatures, he said. She smirked. I've lived among them. That night a wind rose. The children pressed close to Lucille, restless. Elias lit an extra lantern, left the bedroom door open a crack. As the wind howled, Lucille whispered stories to the children, nothing fancy, just pieces of memory worn smooth with time. He sat on the floor outside the door, back against the wall, listening. In the morning, she found him asleep there, arms crossed, boots still on. She didn't wake him, just placed a folded blanket over his chest and walked away, barefoot and quiet. The silence between them was changing, less like absence, more like reverence. And in that stillness, something had begun to grow, not love, not yet, but maybe the roots of it. By the end of the week, Elias added another plate to the table without comment. Lucille swept the floor twice instead of once. The children no longer asked if they would leave tomorrow. It had become, between all of them, a quiet arrangement. One no one had spoken aloud. One no one dared to break. The wind arrived like a whisper that wouldn't leave. It brushed the tops of the Joshua trees, stirred the prairie grass into a ripple, and slipped through the cracks in the barn like a rumor. It carried a scent of rain, not the full promise, but a memory of it, distant and aching. Lucille stood on the porch, her eyes tracing the horizon. Storms in the desert didn't often make it to Boone Hollow, but when they did, they came fast and without apology. Her hair lifted slightly with the wind, and behind her, the children chased each other through a patch of scrub as if the world had never hurt them. Inside the house, Elias sat with the ledger open, a half-used pencil in his hand. He was trying to make sense of numbers that didn't change no matter how he rearranged them. The wheat hadn't come up right. The cattle had dwindled to 2 old steers, and a bull too tired to pretend. His grandfather's land, once fertile and stubbornly proud, was now surviving on habit alone. He looked up when the screen door creaked. Lucille entered carrying Laney, who had twisted her ankle trying to leap from a tree stump. Elias raised a brow. She said the wind dared her, Lucille murmured. Laney grinned sheepishly, one arm curled around Lucille's neck, the other holding a battered doll. Elias cleared space on the table and nodded toward the chair. Let me see. Lucille hesitated, then set the girl down gently. Elias kneeled, careful. Laney watched him, uncertain but not afraid. He took her ankle in his hands, rough palms, but gentle fingers. She winced, but didn't cry. Sprain, he said. Needs rest and cold cloth. Lucille handed him one without being asked. He met her eyes. You always carry everything. Her voice was dry. Only what's mine. They wrapped Laney's foot, and Elias handed her a peppermint from his pocket. She looked at Lucille, who nodded once. Only then did the girl take it, eyes wide, wonder blooming behind them. Later that evening, thunder rolled in over the hills. A storm, real this time. Lucille pulled the children in early, her movements tight with memory. Elias stoked the fire and shuttered the windows. Rain hit the roof in fits and starts, then settled into a rhythm like distant drumming. The children curled on the rug near the hearth. Lucille sat with them, weaving a story from nothing, about a fox who lost her tail and a badger who found it. Elias watched from his chair, a faint smile tracing his face. Lucille had learned to soften her voice, to draw their imaginations forward like thread through a needle. She spoke not like a mother who commanded, but like a survivor who invited her children to build a world better than the one they'd escaped. When the youngest, Eli, dozed off, she met Elias's gaze across the room. Something passed between them. Not thanks. Not yearning. Just recognition. That night, they drank coffee while the rain tapped against the windows. "You don't talk much about your past," Lucille said quietly. "Nothing in it worth repeating." "Still," she said, "sometimes telling is how we bury things right." Elias traced the rim of his cup with one finger. His voice was a low hum, sanded down by time. "Had a daughter once. Never took a breath." Lucille's fingers froze on the handle of her mug. She said nothing, just waited. "Wife left after. Said the silence was too loud. Couldn't sleep in a house with an empty cradle." Lucille nodded, slow. "Grief is a room you can't leave, only redecorate." They sat like that for a long time. The next day brought heat behind the storm, a steam that rose from the dirt and left sweat behind ears and between shoulder blades. The triplets grew restless, itching for something bigger than the homestead could offer. Elias brought out a pair of old saddles and showed them how to brush the horses. Levi named one of them General and the other Daisy, even though both were geldings long past war or flowers. He taught them gently, letting their hands find confidence before he handed over the reins. Lucille watched from the fence line, arms folded, a small line between her brows. "Not worry. Something older. They trust you," she said later. "They trust you first," Elias replied. She looked at him, then really looked, as if trying to decide something that had no easy answer. That night, laughter spilled from the porch as Lainey told a joke that made no sense, but somehow unraveled the others. Lucille's head tipped back as she laughed, the sound unfamiliar in the open air, but not unwelcome. Elias chuckled under his breath, a sound so rare even he startled himself. It was then that the rider appeared, a dark shape against the pale dust of the path, horse moving at a steady clip. As he came closer, the laughter died, folding back into silence like a curtain drawn quick. The man dismounted, tying his horse to the post with too much force. His badge caught the dying light, a six-pointed star dulled by dust and disuse. "Sheriff Trask." Lucille stiffened. Elias noticed. Trask's face was carved from dry rock, narrow eyes, thin mouth, the kind of man who never smiled unless someone else was crying. He nodded at Elias, then tipped his hat toward Lucille, without warmth. "Didn't expect to find you this far out, Miss Whitlow." Elias stood. "She's not a problem." Trask ignored him. "Got papers say otherwise. Someone in Gravel Ridge filed a report. Said she ran off with 3 kids who weren't legally hers." Lucille's jaw clenched. "They're mine. No court's ever ruled otherwise." "No court ever got the chance," Trask said. "You disappeared before anyone could ask the right questions. They were going to take them, give them to Jonas's sister. She's got money, but no love. I ran to save them." "Still," Trask drawled, "running makes you look guilty." Elias stepped forward. "You here to take her in?" "Not today," Trask said, sliding the papers back into his satchel. "Just letting you know she's marked. Folks will come asking sooner or later." He turned, mounted, and rode off before anyone could answer. Lucille stared after him a long time. Elias said nothing. Inside, the children asked questions. She answered them in a voice that didn't tremble. When the house went quiet again, she found Elias on the porch. "I can leave in the morning," she said. "You've done more than enough." He stared out at the stars. "You didn't do anything wrong. Doesn't always matter. You won't run." She turned toward him. "And if I stay, I won't let anyone take you." The wind picked up again, curling around their boots. A single tumbleweed rolled down the path, aimless. "I'm tired of running," Lucille whispered. "Then stop." She studied his face, looking for doubt. Found none. In the silence that followed, something between them shifted. Not love yet, but the bones of it. Later that night, Elias found her fixing the hinge on the back door. "You don't have to keep mending things," he said. "I'm not doing it for you," she replied, but her voice was soft. He stepped closer, close enough to see the threads of silver in her hair that hadn't been there when she first arrived. close enough to smell the faint soap she used, the same one his mother used to make from lavender and ash. "You're good at staying," he said. She didn't look up. "Only because I've learned how to leave." He reached for the screwdriver in her hand, gently closed her fingers around it. "Not here," he said. Outside, the wind sighed again. But this time, it passed without stirring anything loose. Inside, the fire crackled. The children slept. And two people who hadn't meant to belong to anything began, in small and silent ways, to belong to each other. The morning began like any other, with low pink light cresting over the hills and wind whispering through the dying wheat. Lucille stirred the pot on the stove, humming under her breath. The children were outside, chasing one another around the corral, their laughter thin but bright against the hush of the land. Elias leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching them with the faintest curve to his mouth. They looked like a family, the kind that didn't announce itself but moved in rhythm, quiet glances, shared habits, hands passing tools without needing to ask. Elias had begun to rise before dawn again, not from habit, but because he wanted more hours in the day like this. More time to memorize the way Lucille tucked Lainey's hair behind her ear, or how Levi took to chores with silent pride, or how Eli still held a spoon like a fist, but tried to sit straighter each morning. But under it all was a feeling like thunder buried in the dirt. The sheriff hadn't returned, but his warning lingered. Lucille spoke less each day, not with distance, but with wariness. At night, when the children slept, she walked the property line, slow and watchful, as if she could spot judgment before it crossed into their peace. Elias saw it in her, how her shoulders coiled tighter, how her eyes flicked toward the road at every hoofbeat in the distance. He wanted to protect her, but didn't know what shape that promise should take. She hadn't asked for rescue, only space, and he'd given it. That afternoon, the wind shifted, hot and wrong. A dry crackling in the air. Elias smelled it before he saw it. Smoke. Thin, at first, like someone burning brush. But then thicker, hungrier. He ran. The barn was already aflame by the time he reached it. Flames clawed at the roof, greedy and wild. The horses screamed inside. General kicked at the stall, eyes rolling white. Elias grabbed the latch, but heat licked up his arms. The wood blistered his palms. Still, he didn't stop. He slammed his shoulder into the stall door, over and over until it gave. The horse barreled out, nearly trampling him in its terror. Behind him, the structure groaned. Lucille appeared then, barefoot, her skirt catching cinders at the hem. She grabbed a water bucket, threw it uselessly against the blaze. "The children," she gasped. "They're still at the creek." Elias pointed toward the gulch. "The fire's heading south. The wind's on our side for now. Go. I've got the barn." But she didn't move. Another beam cracked and fell, inches from Elias's shoulder. Lucille stepped forward. "You'll die in there. I can get the rest out." She reached for him then, grabbing his shirt, pulling him back toward her with a strength he didn't expect. "No more saving what's already burning," she said, eyes fierce, breath ragged. And he stopped. Together they ran. By the time the fire had eaten the barn down to black bones, the children were back, breathless and safe. The smoke had not touched them. They stood together, eyes wide as dinner plates, clutching each other. Elias dropped to his knees, the earth warm beneath him. He pressed his forehead to the dirt and breathed in the ash. It was Lainey who came to him first, wrapping her arms around his shoulders without a word. Then the boys, then Lucille, who knelt beside him and took his burnt hands in hers, whispering something he couldn't hear, but felt like a prayer. They had nothing left to save in the barn, but they had saved one another. The fire had taken something, but not everything. When night fell, Elias sat on the porch with a bandaged hand and smoke still clinging to his hair. Lucille joined him in silence. "I should have let it go sooner," he said. She looked over at him. "Some things we try to fix because we think we're supposed to. It was my father's barn." "I know," she said, voice low. "But your life isn't in it." They didn't speak again for a while, but her hand stayed near his, close enough to feel warmth. The next morning, Sheriff Trask returned. He rode up slow, looking too satisfied. A sheet of paper flapped in his hand. "Judge signed an order," he said, eyes not leaving Lucille. "You're to report to the county courthouse. Formal hearing. They're claiming neglect, unfit housing, unlawful flight. The usual pile of dirt." Lucille stood straight, jaw tight. "And if I don't go, they'll send a deputy next time. One with irons." Elias stepped forward. "You said they hadn't ruled anything. Now they aim to. I won't let you take her." Trask lifted one brow. "You got claim to her? Marriage? Blood?" Elias stared at him. Lucille's voice broke the air. "He doesn't need to answer that." But Elias turned to her. His face was stone, but his voice held something new, urgency carved with reverence. "Marry me," he said. The words stunned the yard. Even the wind seemed to stop. Lucille blinked. "You don't mean that." "I do. Not for pity. Not for rescue. But because I can't watch them take you. You can't decide that for me. I'm not. I'm offering." Trask scoffed. "This won't hold up in court. It's desperation." Elias turned to him, eyes cold. "It's a covenant." Lucille looked between them, then down at the children, who huddled behind the porch rail, eyes wide, silent. She stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and Trask. "I won't marry a man to be saved," she said, "but I'll stand beside one if he sees me as I am." Elias nodded. "I see you." Something passed between them, stronger than words, older than law. Trask exhaled sharply. "You've got 1 week. If you're not in that courthouse by then, they'll come. With chains." He turned, mounted, and left the way he come. Dust settled in his wake, but it did not linger long. Elias turned to Lucille. "I meant it. Every word." "I know," she said. They stood facing each other, not touching, not needing to. That night, they sat around the hearth. The children asked if they were leaving. Lucille shook her head. "This is our land now," she said. "Not because it's safe, but because it's true." Laney crawled into her lap. Levi leaned his head against Elias's side. Eli curled at their feet like a pup who knew the pack had closed around him. The fire crackled. The barn was gone. The law was coming. But Elias Boone had chosen not out of fear, but from the deepest part of himself, the part that still believed in shelter, in loyalty, in a kind of love that doesn't speak its name but shows up anyway. Lucille Whitlow had been called many things: burden, runaway, liar. But now, in the ash-streaked heart of Boone Hollow, she was something else. Chosen. And the wind that once threatened to scatter them now carried only the scent of wood smoke, and something faint but rising behind it. Hope.